Hey there, friends. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, I've got a story you're going to love. But before we settle in, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these cozy tales. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see our little storytelling circle stretch across the globe. Now dim those lights, get comfy, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The birth of a noble boy, 100 BCE to 85 BCE. The summer sun hung heavy in the sky over Rome in the year 100 BCE, when a baby boy was born into one of the oldest and most respected families in the city, the Julius family. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. That name, even back then, carried a kind of silent weight. The Julia claimed to descend from the goddess Venus herself, which sounded impressive at feasts and family gatherings, but didn't exactly pay the bills. Because while their name was noble, their fare had dwindled over generations. The Caesar branch of the family had seen better days. Still, being born into the Julia meant Caesar started life with status, a social key that could unlock doors if you knew how to turn it right. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, held a modest political role as a praetor, a type of Roman judge. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, however, was the true force in the household. She was smart, strict, and highly respected, even among Rome's elite women. Some even said she had more steel in her than her husband. Caesar's early life was shaped by the rhythm of Roman traditions, the clatter of chariots, the sharp clinking of togas being adjusted, the fiery debates in the forum. All of it created a buzzing, intense atmosphere to grow up in. As a boy, Caesar was taught at home by tutors who gave him lessons in reading, writing, Greek, Latin, and Roman law. Greek was especially important in high society. If you couldn't quote Homer or debate like Aristotle, you were considered uncultured. Caesar, as it turns out, had a sharp mind. He wasn't just memorizing poetry and philosophy, he understood them. He questioned things. He liked to talk, argue, and most of all, persuade, that would become a signature skill later in his life. He loved to read stories of great generals and leaders from the past. Men like Alexander the Great fascinated him. Even as a child, he dreamed of doing something legendary. Rome at this time was no peaceful place, though. The Republic was creaking under the weight of political corruption, angry mobs, and endless power struggles. There were powerful families constantly fighting each other in both the Senate and the streets. Caesar may have been born into nobility, but that didn't mean safety or ease. Politics was a bloody game in Rome, and if you played, you had to be ready to lose everything, including your life. When Caesar was about 15 or 16, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly while putting on his shoes one morning. According to some stories, just like that, young Caesar became the head of the family. That was a heavy burden for a teenager still learning Latin grammar and war strategies from dusty scrolls. But he didn't complain. There was no time to complain. Rome didn't wait for boys to grow up slowly. It demanded, and quickly. Now Caesar wasn't rich, but he was ambitious. He understood early on that ambition could take him further than money ever could. That, combined with charm, made him a figure people noticed. His eyes were dark and thoughtful, and he always seemed to listen closely when others spoke, a rare thing in a city full of loud mouths. He had an air of confidence, not arrogance, which made people trust him. At around this time, he got involved with a girl named Cornelia. She was the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a powerful man who had once been an enemy of the dictator Sulla. Their marriage was as much a political move as it was personal. In Rome, nearly every marriage among the upper class was about power, alliances, and family ties more than love. Still, Caesar stayed loyal to Cornelia throughout her life, and her family connection would put him on a collision course with danger. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Rome's most powerful man at the time, was not a fan of Caesar's new father-in-law. Sulla had returned to Rome with an army and made himself dictator, cleaning house of his enemies in a violent campaign known as the Proscriptions. These were public lists of people marked for death, and once your name was on it, you were as good as gone. Property was seized, families were ruined, and fear gripped the city. When Sulla found out that Caesar had married Cornelia, he wasn't pleased. He ordered Caesar to divorce her immediately. Now, this was a test. A lot of young men would have obeyed without hesitation to save their skin. But Caesar refused. He stood by his wife, knowing full well it could cost him everything. This decision tells you something very real about Caesar. He wasn't easily frightened, and he didn't back down from powerful enemies. Of course, Sulla didn't take the defiance lightly. He stripped Caesar of his priesthood, took away his wife's dowry, and added his name to the list of people marked for execution. Caesar had to run. He went into hiding, moving from house to house, living in the shadows like a criminal. His life was hanging by a thread. He even had to bribe Sulla's allies just to be allowed to live. Friends and family intervened on his behalf, pleading for his life. Eventually, Sulla agreed to spare Caesar, but he did so reluctantly. According to legend, Sulla muttered, "That boy Caesar has many Mariuses in him," referring to Caesar's uncle by marriage, the once great general Gaius Marius. It was a warning, not a compliment. With his life spared but his future in ruins, Caesar did something clever. He left Rome. He joined the military and went off to Asia Minor, where Roman legions were fighting in minor campaigns. It was safer, and Caesar knew he needed to build a new life for himself, one based not on family connections, but on his own merit. As a soldier, Caesar showed bravery and skill. He fought in battles, proved himself in dangerous situations, and earned honors early in his career. There's even a story where he rescued the standard of a legion by swimming across enemy lines and fighting back with just a sword. Whether true or exaggerate, stories like these made Caesar a name to remember. After his military service, he did something unusual. He decided to study public speaking in Rhodes. In Rome, a good orator was as powerful as a sword-wielding general. Words could move crowds, shame senate, and change laws. Caesar wanted to master that skill. But on the way to Rhodes, he was captured by pirates. Yes, pirates. These pirates held him for ransom and asked for 20 talents of silver. Caesar, with that famous confidence, laughed in their faces and said they were undervaluing him. He insisted they demand 50 talents instead. They agreed, amused by his boldness. While waiting for the money to arrive, Caesar made himself at home. He wrote poetry, gave speeches, and even shushed the pirates when they didn't pay attention. He promised he'd come back and crucify them once he was free. They thought he was joking. He wasn't. As soon as the ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar raised a fleet, hunted the pirates down, and did exactly what he said he would: crucified them all. It was brutal, but it was also a message. Caesar was not a man you crossed lightly. By the time he returned to Rome, he wasn't just the young noble boy from a once great family. He was a survivor, a soldier, a thinker, and most important, he had a growing reputation, a whisper of greatness that would only get louder with time. In the years between 100 BCE and 85 BCE, Caesar had transformed. He had lost his father, stood up to a dictator, been hunted, exiled, fought in wars, been kidnapped, and came back stronger than ever, all before he was 30 years old. That's how legends begin, not with perfect lives, but with storms that shape them. For Caesar, the storm had only just begun. The rise of a young star, 84 BCE to 70 BCE. By the time Julius Caesar returned to Rome, he was no longer just a young nobleman clinging to a fading family name. He was someone who had stared death in the face more than once and lived to talk about it. And not only that, he had done it with style, clever, and a bit of swagger. The story of him telling pirates to ask for a higher ransom wasn't just funny, it was unforgettable. Word had gotten around. Rome had its eyes on him now, curious to see what this bold, sharp, and surprisingly charming young man would do next. He stepped back into the city with quiet confidence. Rome was still the same chaotic mess of ambition, betrayal, and politics, but Caesar had changed. He knew now how dangerous Rome could be. but he also knew he had the tools to rise. And that's exactly what he planned to do. In those days, getting anywhere in Roman politics required two things: powerful friends and public favor. Caesar knew how to make both. He started by reconnecting with some old family allies, including those tied to the populares, the faction of politicians who supported reforms to help the common people. It was a smart move. Rome was increasingly divided between the wealthy elites, known as the optimates, and the populares, who often acted as champions of the lower classes. Caesar's uncle Marius had been a populares hero, so it made sense for Caesar to follow a similar path. Around this time, his wife Cornelia died. It hit Caesar hard. Despite the political nature of their marriage, he had genuinely loved her. He gave a heartfelt speech at her funeral, and the way he spoke, graceful and motioned in moving, only increased his reputation in the city. The people were impressed by his work, and even some of the more stoic senators took notice. But Caesar didn't wallow in grief. He couldn't afford to. He needed to keep moving, so he set his sights on climbing the political ladder, one step at a time. The first real office he went after was that of a military tribune, which he secured without much difficulty. It was a small role, but it gave him experience and visibility. Not long after that, he became a quaestor, an official who helped manage the finances of the Republic. He was assigned to Spain for his quaestorship, and that experience changed him. Spain wasn't just rolling hills and olive groves. It was rugged, wide, and unpredictable. And being out there, away from the hustle and noise of Rome, gave Caesar time to think. He traveled through ancient cities and saw great statues and temples dedicated to leaders long gone. One day, he came across a statue of Alexander the Great, and it stirred something deep in him. Here was Caesar, in his late 20s, looking at a monument of a man who had conquered most of the known world before the age of 30. Caesar felt a sudden stab of inadequacy, hadn't done anything nearly as remarkable yet. That moment left a mark on him. He would never forget it. From then on, he promised himself he would chase greatness with everything he had. After his time in Spain, he returned to Rome and made a bold move. He ran for the position of aedile. Aediles were responsible for public games, festivals, and maintaining public buildings. But what made this role so powerful was its connection to popularity. The aedile who threw the best games often became a darling of the people. And Caesar, he threw the best games Rome had ever seen. He went deep into debt to make it happen. He borrowed huge sums of money from rich allies and creditors, spending it on lavish gladiator fights, exotic animals, decorations, and food. He knew it was risk, but Caesar had vision. He wasn't just spending, he was investing in himself. The people loved the games. They loved him even more. Soon, chants of his name began to echo through the forum. He was becoming a household name. Even the Senate had to acknowledge him. Some of them whispered behind his back, calling him dangerous, ambitious, maybe even too clever, but they couldn't ignore him. With the support of the people rising, Caesar went after the next step. He became Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. It was an unusual job for someone his age, but he pulled it off. The election was tense, and Caesar used every bit of charm, persuasion, and political leverage he had. He won by a narrow margin, shocking the establishment. His opponents couldn't believe it. The young man they once dismissed as a flashy upstart had just become the spiritual head of Rome. This new role gave him even more visibility and influence. Religion and politics were deeply intertwined in Rome, and being Pontifex Maximus meant he now had a say in both. He used his position to connect with even more citizens, building relationships with local leaders, traders, soldiers, and the common folk. But not everything was about charm and speeches. Caesar understood power in all its forms. He built relationships with the kind of men who could get things done, the ones who controlled money, land, and military strength. Among these were Marcus Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known as Pompey the Great. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome. He had made his fortune through smart business deals and some not-so-subtle real estate schemes. Pompey was a war hero, beloved by the army and celebrated for his military victories in the East. Caesar saw potential in both of them, not just as allies but as part of something bigger. But that would come later. For now, he was still laying the foundation. One of the last major events of this chapter in Caesar's life was his time as a praetor, a position just below consul. It was a sign that he was edging closer to the top. As praetor, he had to enforce law, judge legal disputes, and manage parts of the city's government. It was demanding work, but Caesar did it well. He wasn't just a showman, he could govern with intelligence and fairness when needed. After serving as praetor, Caesar received a governorship in Spain, giving him control over Roman provinces and legions in the region. This was no vacation. Governors were expected to keep the peace, collect taxes, and protect Roman interests, and often they did this by military means. Caesar once again proved he was more than just a politician. He was a capable commander. While in Spain, he led military campaigns against rebellious tribes, won key victory, and expanded Roman influence. His troops respected him because he didn't act like he was above them. He marched with them, slept in their camp, and listened to their concerns. That kind of leadership created loyalty, and Caesar knew the value of loyalty better than anyone. By 70 BC, Caesar had returned to Rome with a fortune earned through conquest and a growing number of supporters. His debts had been paid off, his reputation had grown, and his eyes were set firmly on the highest office in Rome, the consulship. That was where he was heading, and he was getting closer every day. This part of Caesar's life wasn't filled with grand wars or dramatic betrayals. It was the slow, careful build-up of a legend. It was filled with small victories, personal sacrifices, and smart choices. He was calculated, yes, but never cold. He was ambitious, but he didn't trample others just for sport. He played the game better than anyone, and he made sure everyone remembered his name. And Rome remembered. The consulship and the crossing of the Rubicon, 59 BCA to 49 BCA. By 59 BCA, Julius Caesar's rise had become an unstoppable force. He was now on the brink of achieving his ultimate goal, becoming consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic. To many, it seemed like a natural progression, but the road was not as simple as it appeared. In fact, it was one that would test his skill in politics, alliances, and his ability to play the game of power better than anyone. It wasn't just a matter of getting elected. Caesar needed to outmaneuver enemies, form new partnerships, and make bold decisions that would change the course of Roman history. It was no secret that Caesar was ambitious. In fact, it was that very ambition that had gotten him to where he was today. He had already made a name for himself with his military experience, his rich alliances, and his ever-growing plurality with the people. However, the Senate, still heavily controlled by the elite optimates, was far from supportive of his ascent. They saw him as a threat, a man who might disrupt the delicate balance of power and shake the foundations of their control. They didn't trust him, and they certainly didn't like his growing influence. To defeat Caesar had to do what he had done so many times before. He had to make the right allies at the right time, and that's exactly what he did. One of his first moves was to form an alliance with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Crassus and Pompey. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, could provide the financial backing Caesar needed. Pompey, on the other hand, was a military hero with tremendous respect in the army and throughout the Roman provinces. Together, they formed what would be known as the First Triumvirate, a powerful political alliance designed to take on the Senate and secure each man's goals. Caesar's decision to align himself with Pompey and Crassus was a calculated one. He knew that he needed military power, financial support, and the backing of influential men to get elected to the consulship. But he also understood that such alliances could be temporary. Nothing in Roman politics lasted forever. Still, it was a necessary step, and Caesar played his part well. He charmed Pompey, promised Crassus political favors, and made it clear that he was a man with ambition, and that his ambition was very much in alignment with their own. But even with this alliance, Caesar still faced opposition from the Senate. They saw him as a mere upstart with little regard for tradition, and they were determined to keep him from rising too quickly. Caesar, however, had a knack for making the right moves at the right time. He was not only a brilliant politician, he was a master strategist. So he used every weapon in his arsenal, his political savvy, his charisma, his connections to push forward. He began to speak more directly to the people, presenting himself as a champion of the lower classes and a defender of the Republic's true values. By the time the elections rolled around, Caesar was ready. He had secured enough support, not just from the common people, but also from his powerful allies, Crassus and Pompey, who backed his candidacy. Caesar's appeal to the masses worked in his favor, and when the ballots were counted, he was elected consul of Rome. The Senate was furious, but there was nothing they could do. Caesar had won, and now he held the reins of power in his hands. Being consul was a big deal. It was the pinnacle of political life in Rome. It was a time for a man to solidify his legacy, to make his mark on history. And Caesar did exactly that. His first action as consul was to push for legislation that would benefit his allies, secure his political position, and help him fulfill his promises to the people. He pushed through laws that favored land distribution, which helped secure the loyalty of the common folk and veterans. He also secured measures to support the soldiers who had fought for Rome, ensuring they had land and pay after their service. However, not everyone in the Senate was happy with these reforms. The optimates in particular were furious. They saw Caesar's actions as an assault on their privileges, an attack on their power, and a blatant attempt to shift the balance in favor of the people. For Caesar, though, these reforms were simply the first step in his long game. He knew that if he was going to hold on to power, he needed to secure the loyalty of Rome's most important groups: the soldiers, the people, and the wealthy elite. Throughout his consulship, Caesar's moves were deliberate. His political genius became more and more apparent. But while he was working tirelessly to secure his position in Rome, a storm was brewing beyond the city's walls. Pompey, despite his military fame, was having trouble securing land for his veterans. And Crassus, although the richest man in Rome, was dissatisfied with his position in the triumvirate and sought greater influence. The alliance that had worked so well for Caesar was starting to show cracks. The ambitious men who had once supported him now seemed to have their own agendas. While Caesar was dealing with these political pressures, he was also looking beyond the city's borders. He knew that Rome's enemies were growing stronger, and if he wanted to secure his place in history, he would need to prove his military prowess once again. So he began to set his sights on Gaul, a region rich in resources, with tribes eager to fight for independence. It was a gamble, but Caesar was not afraid to take risks. But before he could march on Gaul, the crisis within the first triumvirate reached its breaking point. Crassus was killed in battle during the ill-fated campaign against the Parthians in 53 BCE, leaving Pompey and Caesar to vie for control. The bond between them, once so strong, was now fragile. Pompey, fearing Caesar's growing power, began to distance himself from his old ally. He aligned himself with the Senate, hoping to curb Caesar's influence. It was at this point that Caesar faced his greatest challenge yet. To maintain his power, he knew he needed to act quickly. In 49 BCE, he made the fateful decision that would alter the course of history. He crossed the Rubicon River with his army, defying the Senate's orders and marching on Rome itself. The phrase "crossing the Rubicon" has since become synonymous with taking a point of no return. For Caesar, it was the point where politics and war collided. It was his declaration of war on the Senate and a gamble for the future of the Republic. The Senate, caught off guard, scrambled to respond, but Caesar was too quick. He marched into Rome, took control of the city, and declared himself dictator for life. His decision to cross the Rubicon was not just a political move, it was a declaration that he would stop at nothing to reshape the Roman world. With Pompey's forces defeated, Caesar now stood at the height of his power. He had beaten his enemies, both political and military, and he was ready to transform the Republic into something entirely new. Rome would never be the same again. The dictatorship and the fall of the Republic, 49 BCA to 44 BCA. After crossing the Rubicon, Julius Caesar had initiated a chain of events that would unravel the Roman Republic as it had existed for centuries. He was now the undisputed master of Rome, but his reign, although marked by swift victories and political genius, would also be defined by the growing tension between the old guard and the new order he sought to impose. It was a time of great transformation, a time when the very idea of the Republic, with its Senate and its checks and balances, would be put to the ultimate test. Caesar's march into Rome in 49 BCE was the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic, but it also marked the beginning of his efforts to shape a new Rome, a Rome that reflected his own vision of power and governance. With the Senate scattered and many of his political enemies in flight, Caesar wasted no time in consolidating his power. His first move was to establish himself as the supreme authority, and he did so by taking on the title of dictator. The role of dictator in Rome was a temporary appointment, usually granted during times of crisis, and it allowed the holder extraordinary powers for a short duration. However, Caesar's dictatorial powers were far from temporary. He would soon make it clear that he intended to hold onto them for as long as he could. For the people of Rome, Caesar's dictatorship was, in many ways, a breath of fresh air. Under his rule, Rome saw a series of reforms that many believed were necessary for the Republic's survival. He enacted laws that addressed issues of wealth, inequality, land distribution, and debt relief. He provided land to soldiers and veterans, ensuring their loyalty, and he reorganized the calendar, introducing the Julian calendar, which we still use today. Caesar also restructured the Senate, increasing its membership and including more of his supporters to ensure his policies would be enacted. These reforms made Caesar incredibly popular with the people, but they also alienated many of the old elites who felt that their power was being undermined. One of the most significant moves Caesar made was to declare himself dictator for life in 44 BCE. This declaration was the final blow to the old republic, which had been governed by a system of elected officials who held power for fixed terms. Caesar's decision to make his rule permanent was a clear signal that he had no intention of restoring the traditional political system. The Senate, once the heart of Roman political life, had been reduced to a rubber stamp for Caesar's decisions. The Optimates, the conservative faction of the Senate, saw this as an outright threat to their power and to the very idea of a republic where power was supposed to be shared. But Caesar's decision to take such bold steps was not made in a vacuum. He had been dealing with the challenges of the Republic for years, and he believed that Rome's traditional systems of governance were outdated and inefficient. The Senate was divided, corrupt, and often paralyzed by infighting. Caesar had seen firsthand how the Republic's system of checks and balances prevented action on important issues, and he had decided that only a strong, centralized leadership could bring Rome back to its former glory. His reforms were aimed at strengthening Rome, at creating a more unified and efficient state that could stand tall against its enemies and continue to expand its influence. However, the more Caesar consolidated power, the more discontent grew among the Roman elite. His supporters, those who benefited from his reforms, were pleased with his leadership, but the traditional ruling class began to feel increasingly threatened. They had watched as Caesar systematically eliminated political rivals and pushed for policies that undermined their authority. The Senate, which once had the final say on nearly all matters of Roman governance, was now little more than a shadow of its former self, with Caesar at the helm. Among those who felt particularly aggrieved were a group of senators who believed that Caesar's actions were leading Rome into tyranny. They feared that Caesar's dictatorship, once entrenched, would become hereditary, passing down to his heirs, and that the idea of a republic of power being shared among the people would be lost forever. It was this fear of permanent autocracy that led to the formation of a conspiracy to kill Caesar. This group of senators, known as the Liberators, included some of Caesar's closest allies and friends, such as Brutus and Cassius, who had once fought beside him in the civil wars. These men were torn between their loyalty to Caesar and their belief that his reign posed a danger to the very fabric of Roman democracy. As Caesar's popularity continued to grow, so did the tension in the Senate. The liberators began to plot his assassination, seeing it as the only way to preserve the Republic. In the weeks leading up to the Ides of March, Caesar's enemies moved closer to their goal, secretly organizing and making plans to strike. On the fateful day of March 1544 BCE, Caesar made his way to the Senate House, unaware that it would be the last time he would set foot in the building that had once been the center of Roman power. As he entered the Senate, he was surrounded by conspirators who had gathered to carry out their deadly plan. They attacked him with daggers, striking him multiple times, including one fatal blow from Brutus, whom Caesar is famously said to have looked at with disbelief, asking, "Et tu, Brutus?" Caesar's assassination was a dramatic moment in Roman history, but it was also a moment of paradox. The man who had done so much to reshape Rome, who had fought to secure its power and glory, was struck down by the very people he had once trusted. His death, however, did not bring the return of the Republic that the conspirators had hoped for. Instead, it threw Rome into another period of civil war. Caesar's supporters, including his loyal general Mark Antony, fought to avenge his death and maintain his legacy, while those who had plotted his assassination found themselves unable to take control of the city. The death of Caesar did not restore the Roman Republic. Instead, it marked the final collapse of the system that had once governed Rome. The power struggles that followed Caesar's death would eventually lead to the rise of the Roman Empire under Caesar's adopted heir Octavian, who would become Augustus. In many ways, the assassination of Caesar was the death knell for the Republic, signaling the end of an era and the dawn of a new age of imperial rule. Caesar's life, his rise to power, his reforms, and his eventual assassination were a testament to the complexities of Roman politics, where ambition, loyalty, and fear all played their part in shaping the course of history. As for Caesar, despite his assassination, his legacy endured. His reforms, his leadership, and his vision for Rome left an indelible mark on the city and the world. While he did not live to see the new Rome he had hoped to build, his influence would continue to shape the Roman Empire for centuries to come. The name of Julius Caesar would become synonymous with power, ambition, and the ultimate fate of the Republic. A reminder that in Rome, as in history itself, the tides of fortune could change in an instant, and nothing, no matter how powerful, was ever truly permanent. The rise of the Second Triumvirate, 43 BC to 31 BC. After the shocking assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, Rome found itself in a state of chaos and uncertainty. The Republic, already shaken by the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, now seemed on the brink of collapse. But even in death, Caesar's influence loomed large over the city, and his supporters would not let his vision die with him. Out of the rubble of Caesar's murder, a new political alliance began to take shape, one that would once again reshape the future of Rome. This was the Second Triumvirate, a powerful coalition of three men, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, who would fight to avenge Caesar's death and claim Rome for themselves. At first, it was Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and friend, who seemed to hold the reins of power in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination. He had been one of the most trusted officers in Caesar's army and had served as a co-consul in the year before Caesar's death. He was also a man with strong personality and an unyielding sense of loyalty to Caesar's memory. But Antony, despite his prominence, could not claim the position of sole ruler of Rome, and his attempts to consolidate power were complicated by the fact that Caesar had named his grandnephew Octavian as his adopted son and heir. Octavian, who was just a teenager at the time, was now a player in the political game, and although he was inexperienced, he was also ambitious and determined to secure his future. Octavian wasted no time in asserting his place in the political arena. He quickly made his way back to Rome, where he began to rally Caesar's supporters to his cause, presenting himself as the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy. Octavian's position was strengthened by the fact that he could claim a direct connection to the powerful Caesar, but it was also weakened by the fact that he was young and relatively unknown. To solidify his position, Octavian needed allies, men who had the military experience and political clout that he lacked. This is where Mark Antony came into play. Antony, despite his efforts to maintain control, found himself at a crossroads. He had the loyalty of Caesar's veterans and a powerful base of support in the east, but he also faced political opposition from the Senate, which saw him as a potential tyrant. Antony, for all his strength, had enemies in Rome who were willing to challenge him, and he needed to secure his position. In an attempt to secure his power, he sought out an alliance with Octavian, a move that would ultimately lead to the creation of the Second Triumvirate. The Second Triumvirate was different from the first, more informal triumvirate that had existed between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. This time, the three men, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, officially and legally formed a ruling body, with the right to make laws and decisions without the approval of the Senate or the people. They were granted immense power, and their rule was backed by the legion, which gave them the strength to crush opposition. The triumvirs quickly moved to avenge Caesar's death by hunting down and killing those responsible for the assassination, including many of the senators who had conspired against him. They were ruthless in their pursuit of vengeance, and anyone associated with the conspiracy was put to death. The political landscape of Rome had now changed dramatically. The Senate, which had once been the dominant force in Roman politics, was now a mere shadow of its former self, and the triumvirs held almost absolute power. Octavian and Antony, once political rivals, had now become allies, and together they sought to strengthen their grip on Rome. Their first major challenge came in the form of the remnants of Caesar's enemies, particularly those led by Brutus and Cassius, the two leading conspirators behind Caesar's assassination. These men had fled to the east after Caesar's death, and they had managed to rally a significant army to their cause. The stage was set for a massive confrontation, and the future of Rome would be decided on the battlefield. The battle that would determine the fate of the Republic and the future of its rulers came at Philippi in 42 BCE. The forces of the triumvirs led by Octavian and Antony faced off against Brutus and Cassius in what would become one of the most decisive battles in Roman history. The battle was long and hard fought, but in the end, the forces of the triumvirs emerged victorious. Brutus and Cassius were both killed, and their army was scattered. The victory at Philippi marked the end of the last major resistance to the triumvirate's rule, and it solidified Octavian and Antony's dominance over Rome. But victory in battle did not guarantee peace. The alliance between Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus was one of convenience, and it was never as strong as it appeared. Despite their shared goal of avenging Caesar's death and securing their own power, the three men had different ambitions and competing interests. Antony, who had been given control of the eastern provinces, was eager to expand Rome's influence in the east. Octavian, on the other hand, had his eyes firmly fixed on Rome and the west, where he sought to solidify his position as Caesar's heir. Lepidus, the third member of the triumvirate, was largely sidelined in the power struggle, and his influence quickly waned. As time went on, the tensions between Antony and Octavian grew more pronounced. Antony's increasing closeness to Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, further strained relations between the two men. Octavian, who had been trying to present himself as the defender of Rome's traditional values, seized upon Antony's relationship with Cleopatra as evidence that Antony had become too foreign and too distracted by luxury. Octavian used this to stir up public opinion against Antony, portraying him as a traitor to Rome, who was more interested in his love affair with Cleopatra than in the welfare of the Republic. This propaganda war reached its climax in 31 BCE, when Octavian and Antony faced each other in the Battle of Actium, a naval engagement that would decide the future of Rome. At Actium, Octavian's forces decisively defeated Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. The battle was a turning point in Roman history, as it marked the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. Antony and Cleopatra both committed suicide shortly after the battle, and Octavian emerged as the sole ruler of Rome. He would soon take the title of Augustus, and in doing so, he became the first emperor of Rome, ending the centuries-long experiment with the Republic. The Second Triumvirate, once a powerful political force, had crumbled under the weight of personal ambition and political rivalry, leaving Octavian as the undisputed ruler of the Roman world. The rise of the Second Triumvirate and its eventual collapse marked the end of an era for Rome. What had started as a political alliance designed to avenge Caesar's death had turned into a brutal struggle for power, with the fate of the Republic hanging in the balance. It was the beginning of the Imperial Age, a new chapter in Rome's history that would see the rise of emperors and the fall of the system that had once governed the city. And while Octavian's victory at Actium would lead to the establishment of a new political order, the legacy of the Second Triumvirate would live on as a reminder of the fragility of power, the dangers of ambition, and the ultimate cost of seeking control in a world where loyalty and betrayal were often intertwined. Augustus and the establishment of the empire, 31 BCE to 14 CE. After Octavian's resounding victory at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, the future of Rome was in his hands. The death of Antony and Cleopatra, followed by the end of the Second Triumvirate, marked the conclusion of the Republic's long and tumultuous history. For the first time in centuries, Rome was free from the constant threat of civil war and political upheaval. But this peace came at a price. Octavian, now the undisputed master of Rome, was left with the daunting task of reshaping the government to suit his vision. Gone were the days of the Senate's dominance, and Octavian was determined to create a new political order, one that would ensure his power while preserving the appearance of the old republic. When Octavian returned to Rome after his victory, he was met with jubilant crowds and grand celebrations. The people of Rome hailed him as their savior, the man who had brought peace after decades of chaos. Octavian, however, was acutely aware of the challenges that lay ahead. While he was now the most powerful man in the Roman world, he knew that his position was fragile, and any misstep could send the empire back into the turmoil that had plagued it for so long. To solidify his rule, Octavian needed to navigate a delicate political landscape, one where his power could not be seen as overtly dictatorial. He would need to create a government that appeared to respect the traditional values of the Republic while ensuring his own supremacy. Octavian's first move was to take the title of Princeps, which meant first citizen. This title, while seemingly modest, was meant to convey the idea that Octavian was no more than a servant of the state, a man chosen by the people to lead them. It was an image of humility, and it worked well in winning the support of the Senate and the Roman people, who were wary of any leader who might take on the appearance of a king. But while he presented himself as a humble servant of the Republic, Octavian's actual power was absolute. He controlled the army, the treasury, and the law, and his decisions were final. In 27 BCE, Octavian took another crucial step in solidifying his control over Rome. He offered to relinquish his powers and restore the authority of the Senate and the people. But the Senate, eager to keep their favored leader, instead granted him even greater powers. They gave him control of the provinces, which meant that he could appoint governors and oversee military affairs in the vast Roman territories beyond Italy. The Senate also granted him the title of Augustus, a name that signified his elevated status and divine favor. Augustus, as he would now be known, was the first Roman emperor, though he never officially took the title of emperor. He preferred to maintain the appearance of a republic, even while he held the power of an emperor. Augustus's reign, which lasted from 27 BCE until his death in 14 CE, was marked by a series of reforms and a careful balancing act between maintaining the appearance of the republic and consolidating his own power. One of his first major reforms was to reorganize the military. He established a standing army that was loyal to him personally, rather than to individual generals, and he also created the Praetorian Guard, an elite force tasked with protecting the emperor. This move was crucial in securing Augustus's position, as it ensured that he had direct control over the military, which had been the main source of power in Rome for centuries. The loyalty of the army to Augustus was one of the key factors that allowed him to maintain his rule without the need for widespread violence or civil war. Augustus also undertook a series of social and moral reforms aimed at restoring traditional Roman values. He passed laws that encouraged marriage and the bearing of children among the Roman elite, hoping to ensure the future of the Roman aristocracy. He also introduced laws to promote family values and punish adultery, believing that the moral decay of Roman society had been one of the causes of the Republic's downfall. These reforms, while unpopular with some, were designed to reinforce the idea that Augustus was the protector of Roman tradition, a figure who would restore the greatness of Rome. In addition to his moral reforms, Augustus also focused on the physical appearance of Rome itself. He embarked on a massive building program, commissioning the construction of temples, roads, and public buildings that would not only beautify the city, but also demonstrate his power and vision for the future of the empire. One of the most important aspects of Augustus's reign was his ability to secure peace throughout the empire. After years of civil war, the Roman people longed for stability, and Augustus was able to provide it. He established the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and prosperity that lasted for over 2 centuries. This era was characterized by the expansion of Roman influence, the consolidation of Roman power, and the flourishing of trade, culture, and the arts. Under Augustus, the Roman Empire grew to its greatest extent, with provinces stretching from the British Isles in the west to the Mesopotamian region in the east. Augustus understood that peace was essential for the empire's survival, and he worked tirelessly to maintain it by negotiating with foreign powers, securing borders, and establishing a system of client kings who would govern Rome's far-flung territories in exchange for loyalty to Rome. Despite his many successes, Augustus's reign was not without its challenges. In the early years of his rule, he faced resistance from those who had once been loyal to Antony, as well as from other political factions within Rome. Some even questioned his authority, believing that he had become too powerful and too distant from the people. Augustus responded to these threats with a combination of diplomacy and force, using his influence to sway public opinion, and when necessary, using the military to crush opposition. He was also careful to avoid making himself too unpopular, ensuring that his decisions were framed as being in the best interest of Rome and its people. Perhaps one of the most significant challenges of Augustus's reign was his relationship with the Senate. While he had been granted immense power, he knew that the Senate was a vital institution, and he worked hard to maintain its support. At times this meant compromising on certain issues, but it also meant ensuring that the Senate had a role in the governance of the empire, even if it was largely symbolic. Augustus carefully cultivated a relationship with the Senate, using it as a tool to legitimize his rule while still keeping a firm grip on power. His ability to maintain this balance of power between himself, the Senate, and the people was one of his greatest achievements, and it allowed him to establish a stable and enduring regime. Augustus's reign also saw the establishment of a new era in Roman history. He had effectively ended the Republic and created an empire, one that would endure for centuries. His leadership brought about a transformation in Roman society, from the way the government was structured to the way the Roman people saw themselves and their place in the world. Augustus was not only a ruler, he was a symbol of Rome's greatness, and his legacy would shape the empire long after his death. When Augustus died in 14 CE, he left behind an empire that was stronger, more unified, and more prosperous than ever before. His reign had brought Rome into a new era, an era that would see the rise of imperial Rome and the dominance of the Roman Empire over the known world. In the end, Augustus was remembered not only as the first emperor of Rome, but as the man who had ushered in a new age for the Roman people. His reign was a time of stability, peace, and prosperity,
and it laid the foundation for the Roman Empire's long and storied history. Augustus had created an empire that would survive for centuries, and his legacy would live on in the generations of emperors who followed in his footsteps. His vision had transformed Rome from a city-state struggling for survival to the heart of a vast and powerful empire.
Tiberius and the challenges of succession, 14 to 37 CE. When Augustus died in 14 CE, the Roman world entered a new era, one without the guiding hand of the first emperor. Augustus had carefully arranged for his succession, and his stepson, Tiberius, was the man he had chosen to carry on his legacy. Tiberius, born in 42 BCE, had been groomed for leadership from a young age, though not without his share of personal challenges. The son of Augustus's wife Livia and her first husband, Tiberius had once been the second choice for emperor, after Augustus's biological son, Julius Caesar, died young. His rise to power was marked by a combination of military success, personal ambition, and the complicated family dynamics that were ever present at the imperial court. Despite Augustus's carefully laid plans, Tiberius's reign would prove to be more tumultuous than his predecessors, and his leadership would be defined by the struggles of succession, family tensions, and the increasing paranoia that took root in his later years. Tiberius became emperor at a time when Rome had achieved great prosperity under Augustus's rule. The empire was at peace, its borders were secure, and the Senate, though still wary of imperial power, had acquiesced to the new political structure Augustus had established. Tiberius inherited an empire that seemed strong and unified, but his reign would soon reveal that the stability of Rome was fragile, and maintaining it would be no simple task. Upon his accession to the throne, Tiberius was not universally popular, and his rule was clouded by suspicion and distrust. While Augustus had carefully cultivated a positive image throughout his reign, Tiberius had never enjoyed the same affection from the Roman people. He was seen as distant, harsh, and not particularly skilled at winning the hearts of the masses, and his reign would soon be overshadowed by a growing sense of isolation and paranoia. At the beginning of Tiberius's rule, he faced a number of difficult decisions that would shape the course of his reign. One of his first challenges was dealing with the Senate, which had been accustomed to a more hands-off approach during Augustus's rule. Augustus had created a system where the Senate appeared to retain power, but in reality the emperor held the ultimate authority. Tiberius, however, was not as adept at managing the Senate's expectations, and his relationship with its members was strained from the outset. He did not have the same charisma or political acumen as Augustus, and as a result, many senators began to resent the emperor's dominance and sought to challenge his authority. Tiberius, for his part, was increasingly suspicious of the Senate's intentions, which led to a series of purges and the execution of several prominent senators who were accused of plotting against him. This set the tone for much of his reign, which was marked by growing tensions between the emperor and the Senate, as well as a sense of distrust and fear that permeated his administration. One of the key events early in Tiberius's reign was his decision to withdraw from Rome and retire to the island of Capri in 26 CE. This move has been the subject of much debate among historians, and it remains one of the most controversial aspects of his rule. Some argue that Tiberius was simply tired of the burdens of office and sought peace and solitude on Capri, while others believe that he was retreating from the pressures of ruling an empire that had become increasingly hostile and unpredictable. Whatever his reasons, Tiberius's decision to leave Rome effectively abandoned the day-to-day running of the empire to his subordinate, including his trusted prefect Sejanus, who would soon become a powerful figure in his own right. While Tiberius remained emperor in name, Sejanus began to consolidate power, positioning himself as the true ruler of Rome, and his rise would have profound consequences for the empire. The power struggle between Tiberius and Sejanus, as well as the increasing paranoia that gripped the imperial court, defined much of the next decade of Tiberius's reign. Sejanus was ambitious and ruthless, and he saw the emperor's absence from Rome as an opportunity to strengthen his own position. He manipulated the emperor's suspicions
and orchestrated a series of purges that led to the execution of many of Tiberius's perceived enemies. This created an atmosphere of fear and distrust, not only within the palace but also throughout the empire. As Sejanus grew in power, so did the resentment among the people, who began to see the emperor as weak and ineffective. Tiberius, for his part, grew increasingly paranoid and withdrawn, and his decisions became more erratic. He became obsessed with rooting out those he perceived as threats, which only fueled the sense of instability that marked the later years of his reign. In 31 CE, Tiberius's relationship with Sejanus took a dramatic turn when he discovered that his trusted prefect had been plotting to seize power for himself. Tiberius acted swiftly, having Sejanus arrested and executed, along with many of his supporters. This event marked a turning point in Tiberius's reign, as it not only removed a dangerous rival, but also sent shockwaves through the empire. The purges that followed, which targeted those who had been close to Sejanus, further deepened the atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Tiberius, now more isolated than ever, retreated even further into himself, refusing to trust anyone and becoming more reclusive. His reign, which had begun with hope for a stable and prosperous empire, had descended into an era of fear, mistrust, and political intrigue. While Tiberius's relationship with the Senate had been strained throughout his reign, it was during the later years of his rule that it truly broke down. The Senate, once a powerful institution, had become little more than a rubber stamp for Tiberius's decisions, and many senators began to resent the emperor's growing authoritarianism. As Tiberius grew older and more paranoid, he became increasingly determined to eliminate any threat to his power, and his purges intensified. He accused senators of treason, had them executed, and surrounded himself with spies who reported on even the most trivial matters. This created an atmosphere of constant fear, not only among the ruling class but also throughout Roman society. The Senate, once the heart of Roman politics, was now little more than a shadow of its former self, and Tiberius's reign became synonymous with oppression and paranoia. Despite the growing instability of Tiberius's reign, there were some positive developments during his rule. The empire continued to expand under his leadership, particularly in the eastern and northern provinces. Roman forces secured victories in Germania and expanded the empire's borders in the east. But these military successes were overshadowed by the internal turmoil that defined Tiberius's rule. His foreign policy was pragmatic, and he managed to maintain relative peace with the major powers of the Mediterranean world. Yet, despite these achievements, Tiberius's legacy was ultimately defined by his troubled relationship with the Senate, his growing isolation, and the political purges that tarnished his reign. In the final years of Tiberius's life, the empire was in a state of uncertainty. He had no clear successor, and the future of Rome seemed precarious. Tiberius's health began to deteriorate, and he withdrew further from the affairs of the state, leaving the government in the hands of his advisors. In 37 CE, Tiberius died at the age of 77, leaving behind an empire that was deeply divided and uncertain of its future. His death marked the end of an era, and with it came the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the Roman Empire. Tiberius's reign is often seen as one of decline and paranoia, a period in which the promise of Augustus's reign was tarnished by political intrigue, fear, and mistrust. While his rule brought stability to the empire in the early years, his later years were marked by isolation and fear. Tiberius was a man who, despite his military successes and his ability to maintain the empire's borders, could never escape the shadows of suspicion and distrust that haunted him throughout his reign. His legacy, like that of many emperors, is complex and contradictory, one of both achievement and failure, of triumph and tragedy. The challenges he faced as emperor were immense, and his reign serves as a reminder of the delicate balance that must be maintained for an empire to thrive.
Caligula, the reign of madness, 37 to 41 CE. When Tiberius passed away in 37 CE, the Roman Empire found itself at a crossroads. The emperor's death marked the end of a tumultuous reign, and for the first time in over 20 years, the Roman world was faced with the prospect of a new emperor. The man who would take on the mantle was Caligula, the son of Germanicus. one of Rome's most beloved generals. Caligula's rise to power had been a complex one, steeped in family tragedy and the intrigue of imperial politics. But what followed his ascension to the throne was something entirely unexpected, a reign that would come to be synonymous with excess, cruelty, and madness. Caligula was born Gaius Julius Caesar, Germanicus, in 12 CE, the third son of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder. His father, Germanicus, was one of Rome's most celebrated military leaders, and his mother, Agrippina, was a granddaughter of Augustus. As a child, Caligula was familiar with both the splendor and the dangers of the imperial court. His early life was marked by the death of his father, Germanicus, under mysterious circumstances in 19 CE, which many believed was the result of poison. This event profoundly affected Caligula, as his family was thrust into political turmoil, and it left an indelible mark on the young prince. He would later become obsessed with avenging his father's death, and this desire for vengeance would play a significant role in his later actions as emperor. After the death of Tiberius in 37 CE, Caligula was named emperor. At first, his ascension was met with enthusiasm from the people of Rome. Caligula was the grandson of the great Augustus, and many saw him as a symbol of the old imperial family's return to power. His early days in power were marked by generous acts and promises of reforms that made him popular among the masses. He reduced taxes, released political prisoners, and even restored the right of the Senate to have a say in matters of governance. In these early months, it seemed as though Caligula might be the ruler Rome had been waiting for. However, this initial period of goodwill would be short-lived, and soon a much darker side of Caligula's character would begin to emerge. Caligula's reign took a drastic turn just a few months after he came to power. It is widely believed that an illness he contracted in 37 CE, perhaps a severe fever or some form of brain fever, caused a significant change in his behavior. Whatever the cause, it's clear that after his recovery, Caligula's personality underwent a profound shift. The emperor, who had once been hailed as a benevolent leader, soon became a tyrant whose cruelty and capriciousness shock even the most hardened of Roman citizens. Stories began to circulate about his increasing eccentricities, and soon the rumors of his madness could no longer be ignored. One of the earliest signs that Caligula's reign would be unlike that of his predecessors came when he ordered the construction of a massive floating bridge across the Bay of Naples. The bridge, made of ships lashed together, was designed to demonstrate his power over the sea, and Caligula famously rode across it on horse, declaring that he had a mind to be the greatest of emperors. This display of extravagance was just the beginning of a series of increasingly bizarre acts that would define his rule. He began to see himself as a godlike figure, and his behavior became erratic and unpredictable. Caligula's vanity knew no bounds, and he would later have statues of himself placed in temples across the empire, demanding that he be worshipped as a living deity. The emperor's personal life was equally controversial. Caligula had a number of marriages, many of them politically motivated, but his personal relationships were often characterized by cruelty and manipulation. One of the most infamous aspects of Caligula's reign was his treatment of his sisters. He is said to have engaged in incestuous relationships with them, and he even made one of Drusilla, his official co-empress, after her death. The degree of depravity in these actions horrified the Roman elite, but Caligula's disregard for societal norms only seemed to increase his sense of invincibility. As he became more erratic, his cruelty toward others grew as well. Caligula's behavior was not limited to the private sphere. He became notorious for his public cruelty as well. He would often execute individuals on a whim, sometimes for trivial offenses, and his punishments were often carried out with shocking public spectacles. One of the most infamous examples of his cruelty was the execution of a man simply because Caligula had tired of his face and wanted a new one. He also regularly used the threat of death to intimidate the Senate and other political figures. Caligula's reign was marked by a complete disregard for the lives of his subjects, and many of the Roman elite began to fear that the empire was under the control of a madman. But it was not just cruelty that defined Caligula's reign.
it was also his unrelenting desire to display his power in extravagant ways. He ordered the construction of lavish palaces, including a massive, ornate complex on the Palatine Hill. He also spent vast sums of money on lavish games and entertainment, including gladiatorial contests and wild animal hunts. These spectacles were designed to demonstrate his authority and to keep the masses entertained, but they also drained the empire's treasury. Caligula's extravagant spending, combined with his excessive building project, put an immense strain on the Roman economy. At the same time, he ordered the execution of prominent members of the imperial family, including his cousin, the popular general Gemellus, and the former empress Julia Livilla. Despite his early popularity, Caligula's madness soon led to widespread discontent. The Roman elite, once willing to tolerate his eccentricity, began to see him as a serious threat to their power and security. His reign of terror came to a head in 41 CE when a conspiracy was hatched by members of the Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers who had helped secure his rise to power. The conspiracy was led by Cassius Chaerea, a member of the Guard who had grown tired of Caligula's insults and abuses. On the 24th of January 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated in a plot that involved several members of his inner circle. His death marked the end of one of the most infamous reigns in Roman history, and his murder was greeted with a mix of relief and celebration throughout the empire. Caligula's legacy is one of chaos and cruelty. While he was a man of extraordinary charisma, his reign was defined by his descent into madness, his disregard for Roman tradition, and his reign of terror that left a lasting mark on the empire. His reign serves as a cautionary tale of the dangers of absolute power, and it remains one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of the Roman Empire.
The reign of Claudius, 41 to 54 CE. After the brutal assassination of Caligula in 41 CE, the Roman Empire found itself once again at a crossroads. The murder of an emperor, especially one as erratic as Caligula, left the empire in a state of shock and uncertainty. The Praetorian Guard, who had been responsible for Caligula's security, now found themselves in control of the situation, and they quickly sought to find a replacement for the fallen emperor. Their choice was an unexpected one: Claudius, the seemingly weak and infirm uncle of Caligula, who had long been dismissed as unfit for leadership. Claudius was not the kind of person one would expect to become emperor. He was born Tiberius Claudius Drusus in 10 BCE, the son of Drusus and Antonia Minor, both members of the powerful Julio-Claudian family. While he had royal blood, Claudius was largely ignored by the elite of Rome throughout his early life. He had a speech impediment, limp, and was often described as clumsy and awkward. Because of these physical and mental challenges, he was considered unfit for public life, and at times, even treated with disdain by his family. He spent much of his youth in the background, far from the political intrigues of the imperial court. His only real role in society seemed to be that of a scholar, and he spent a great deal of time studying history, literature, and the natural sciences. In many ways, Claudius seemed like an unlikely choice for emperor. He had been overlooked by his family for most of his life, and his physical disabilities made him appear weak and unthreatening. But in the aftermath of Caligula's assassination, the Praetorian Guard needed someone who would be easy to control, and Claudius, despite his lack of experience and perceived weakness, fit that bill. The soldiers found him hiding behind a curtain in the imperial palace, and they declared him emperor on the spot. At first, Claudius himself was shocked by the sudden turn of events, but he quickly realized the opportunity that had been thrust upon him. He accepted the title of emperor, and despite the initial doubts surrounding his ability to rule, Claudius would go on to have one of the longest and most effective reigns of any Roman emperor. Once in power, Claudius proved to be far more capable than anyone had ever expected. He had spent years observing the workings of the Roman government and had a keen understanding of how the empire functioned. His experience as an outsider gave him a unique perspective, and he was able to navigate the complexities of imperial politics with skill. He knew that in order to solidify his position, he would need to earn the loyalty of the people and the Senate. To do this, he focused on restoring stability and order to a Rome that had been deeply shaken by the chaos of Caligula's reign. One of Claudius's first acts as emperor was to punish those responsible for Caligula's assassination. The conspirators, including members of the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, was swiftly executed, and Claudius made it clear that he would not tolerate any challenges to his authority. At the same time, he sought to win the support of the Senate by granting amnesty to some of Caligula's allies and making them a part of his new administration. Claudius was able to establish a working relationship with the Senate, something that had been sorely lacking during Caligula's rule, and this cooperation was key to his success as emperor. Claudius was also a shrewd administrator who took steps to improve the efficiency of the Roman government. He reorganized the imperial bureaucracy, reformed the legal system, and worked to improve the infrastructure of the empire. He focused on building roads, aqueducts, and public buildings, and he made significant improvements to the urban planning of Rome itself. He also worked to expand the empire, overseeing successful military campaigns in Britain, North Africa, and the eastern provinces. One of his most significant achievements was the successful conquest of Britain in 43 CE, a feat that had eluded Roman leaders for centuries. Claudius's victory in Britain brought a new province into the Roman fold and solidified his reputation as a capable and successful military leader. While Claudius was a competent and effective emperor, his reign was not without challenges. One of the most significant challenges he faced was his relationship with his family, particularly his wives and children. Claudius's personal life was marked by a series of turbulent marriages, and his family was often embroiled in scandal and intrigue. He married 4 times during his reign, and his marriages were often motivated by political considerations. His first wife, Messalina, was a powerful and ambitious woman who was infamous for her infidelities. She had numerous affairs during their marriage, and Claudius, despite his awareness of her actions, was seemingly unable to control her. Eventually, Messalina's behavior became too much for Claudius to tolerate, and she was executed in 48 CE for conspiring to overthrow him. After Messalina's death, Claudius married Agrippina the Younger, the daughter of his brother Germanicus. Agrippina was a shrewd and ambitious woman who saw in Claudius an opportunity to advance her own position and that of her son, Nero. Agrippina quickly maneuvered her way into the imperial court, and she became a powerful force behind the throne. However, her ambitions would eventually lead to a tragic downfall. Agrippina poisoned Claudius in 54 CE, ensuring that her son, Nero, would succeed him as emperor. Claudius's death marked the end of an era, and his reign, though filled with successes, was overshadowed by the intrigue and betrayal that surrounded his family. Despite the turmoil within his family, Claudius's legacy as emperor is generally viewed in a positive light. He is remembered as a reformer who improved the governance of the empire, expanded its borders, and restored stability after the chaos of Caligula's reign. His reign marked a return to order and prosperity, and his contributions to the Roman Empire cannot be overlooked. Though his personal life was marked by drama and scandal, Claudius's reign as emperor was one of relative peace and progress, and he remains one of the more capable rulers in the history of Rome.
The rise and fall of Nero, 54 to 68 CE. When Claudius died in 54 CE, the Roman Empire found itself in the hands of a young, untested ruler, Nero, the son of the ambitious Agrippina the Younger. Nero was just 16 years old at the time of his ascension. Despite his youth, his mother had big plans for him. Agrippina believed that with her guidance, Nero would rise to be a powerful and influential emperor. She had maneuvered her way into power, and with Nero now on the throne, she saw an opportunity to control the empire through her son. But Nero, as it would soon become clear, was not the obedient puppet that Agrippina had hoped for. In the early years of Nero's reign, he was heavily influenced by his mother, his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, who were all involved in running the empire.
This period, known as the Reign of the Advisors, saw Nero as a more passive figure. Agrippina, in particular, was the one who took the reins behind the scenes. She sought to consolidate her own power, making strategic decisions for her son and the empire. However, as Nero matured, he grew increasingly resentful of his mother's control and began to assert his own authority. One of the earliest signs of Nero's desire to break free from his mother's grip came when he began distancing himself from her politically. He took a more active role in the decision-making process, and over time, he started to side with his advisors, who were growing wary of Agrippina's influence. Eventually, Nero's relationship with his mother became increasingly strained. In 59 CE, Nero ordered her death, marking the beginning of a darker and more destructive phase in his reign. Agrippina's murder was part of a series of increasingly erratic and ruthless actions that would come to define Nero's rule. With his mother out of the picture, Nero was free to pursue his own desires and ambitions. But his reign would quickly take a turn for the worse. Unlike his predecessor Claudius, who had sought to govern the empire with a sense of stability and reform, Nero was more focused on indulgence and self-interest. As a young emperor, he was eager to leave his mark on the world, but his actions often reflected a disregard for the traditional values of Roman leadership. Rather than governing wisely, he sought to gratify his personal whims, indulging in lavish entertainments and extravagant building projects. One of the first signs that Nero was not fit to rule came with his obsession with artistic pursuits. He was deeply passionate about music, theater, and poetry, and he often performed in public, something that was considered scandalous for an emperor. His performances were not just a display of his artistic abilities but also a way for him to gain the admiration of the Roman populace. However, his indulgence in these performances alienated the Roman elite, who saw such behavior as unbecoming of an emperor. His actions were seen as frivolous and irresponsible, and he began to lose the support of the Senate and the aristocracy. Despite his growing unpopularity among the elite, Nero's rule was still marked by some significant achievements early on. His advisors, particularly Seneca, had helped to establish a relatively stable and prosperous period in the empire's history. Nero continued many of Claudius's reforms, particularly those related to the empire's finances and administration. He was also involved in a series of successful military campaigns, including one in Britain, where he sent forces to further consolidate Roman control over the region. However, his increasing obsession with his own image and his neglect of the day-to-day affairs of governance began to undermine the effectiveness of his rule. One of the most significant events of Nero's reign came in 64 CE, when a devastating fire broke out in Rome. The fire, which lasted for several days, destroyed much of the city and left thousands of people homeless. The disaster was a turning point in Nero's reign, as it marked the beginning of a series of unpopular decisions that would contribute to his eventual downfall. Nero's response to the fire was seen as inadequate. While he did provide some relief efforts and began rebuilding parts of the city, rumors spread that he had been responsible for starting the fire himself. It was said that Nero had wanted to clear space for his grand building projects, including the construction of his lavish golden house. Though there is no concrete evidence to support this claim, the perception that Nero had been responsible for the fire further damaged his reputation. In the aftermath of the fire, Nero began to take more drastic actions in an attempt to rebuild the city and secure his legacy. One of the most controversial measures he took was the persecution of Christians, whom he blamed for the fire. Christians were already viewed with suspicion by the Roman authorities, but Nero's decision to use them as scapegoats for the fire marked the beginning of a brutal period of persecution. Many Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in horrific ways, including being burned alive or thrown to wild animals in the arena. This persecution would continue sporadically throughout Nero's reign, and it contributed to the growing resentment against him from both the general population and the elite. As Nero's reign continued, his actions became increasingly erratic and tyrannical. His behavior grew more unpredictable, and he began to trust fewer and fewer people.
He executed those whom he suspected of disloyalty, including members of his own family. One of the most tragic and notorious murders committed under Nero's rule was that of his own wife, Octavia. Nero had fallen in love with another woman, Poppaea Sabina, and in 62 CE he had Octavia executed to clear the way for their marriage. This act of cruelty further tarnished his reputation and alienated the Roman people. Nero's increasing paranoia and despotism led to a series of revolts throughout the empire. By 68 CE, his grip on power had weakened considerably. The Senate declared him a public enemy, and he was forced to flee Rome. Nero's life ended in tragedy when he committed suicide in June of that year, marking the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His death was followed by a period of civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors, as several claimants to the throne vied for power. Despite the chaos and cruelty of his reign, Nero's legacy remains a subject of debate among historians. Some view him as a tyrant whose indulgence in luxury and disregard for the well-being of his people led to his downfall. Others argue that he was a victim of a smear campaign, and that his reign, while flawed, was not as disastrous as it has been portrayed. Regardless of how one views him, Nero's reign remains one of the most tumultuous and tragic periods in Roman history. His rise to power, his indulgence in the arts, his neglect of governance, and his eventual fall from grace serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of power and the consequences of a ruler's behavior.
The rise of the Flavian dynasty, 69 to 96 CE. After the tumultuous death of Nero in 68 CE, Rome was plunged into chaos. The empire found itself in a state of confusion, with no clear ruler to take the throne. What followed was a year known as the Year of the Four Emperors. In the span of just a few months, 4 different men would claim the imperial purple, each one backed by different factions within the military. The confusion was widespread, but out of this instability would eventually rise a new dynasty, the Flavians, who would restore order to the empire and set the stage for a new era of Roman history. The first of the Flavian emperors was Vespasian, a general who had gained significant military experience during the Jewish revolt in Judea. Vespasian was an unlikely candidate for emperor. He was not from an aristocratic background, and his rise to power was the result of both his military prowess and the political instability following Nero's death. In 69 CE, after the defeat of the previous claimant to the throne, Vitellius, Vespasian was declared emperor by his troops. His victory was not immediate, however, as the empire was still fragmented and he had to fight for control of Rome. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Bedriacum, which saw Vitellius's forces defeated by Vespasian's legions. Upon his victory, Vespasian returned to Rome, where he would begin to restore stability to the empire. He quickly set about consolidating power, and his reign marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty. One of his first acts as emperor was to ensure that he had the support of the Senate. Unlike some of his predecessors, Vespasian knew the importance of maintaining a good relationship with the Senate, as it was the backbone of Roman governance. He also recognized the value of appeasing the military, which had been a driving force behind his rise to power. Vespasian's reign was marked by a pragmatic approach to ruling, as he sought to balance the interests of both the aristocracy and the military. Vespasian's government was focused on restoring financial stability to the empire. Under the previous emperor, the imperial treasury had been drained due to extravagant spending and corruption. Vespasian, a man known for his frugality, began instituting reforms to replenish the state coffers. One of his most famous acts was the imposition of new taxes, including a tax on public urinals, which has become part of Roman law. Although these taxes were unpopular, they helped to stabilize the economy and fund essential public works. Vespasian also sought to reduce the power of the elite, ensuring that the wealth of the empire was more evenly distributed. In terms of military policy, Vespasian continued the campaigns in Judea, which had begun under Nero's reign. The Jewish revolt had raged for several years, and Vespasian's son Titus was tasked with leading the Roman forces to put down the rebellion. The siege of Jerusalem, which would culminate in the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, was one of the most significant events of Vespasian's reign. The victory over the Jews was not only a military success, but also a symbol of Roman dominance in the region. The capture of Jerusalem marked the end of Jewish resistance to Roman rule, and it allowed Vespasian to consolidate control over the eastern provinces. In addition to his military achievements, Vespasian is remembered for his significant contributions to Roman architecture. During his reign, he initiated the construction of the Colosseum, one of the most iconic structures in Rome. The Colosseum, or the Flavian Amphitheater, as it was originally known, was a massive undertaking that would eventually become a symbol of Roman engineering and entertainment. The construction of the Colosseum was one of Vespasian's greatest legacies, and it was a project that would continue under his son Titus. Vespasian's reign also saw the rebuilding of much of the city of Rome, including the restoration of many public buildings and temples that had been damaged or neglected in previous years. Vespasian ruled until his death in 79 CE, at the age of 70. His reign had been marked by stability and consolidation, and his policies helped to restore order after the chaotic period that followed Nero's death. Upon his death, Vespasian was succeeded by his eldest son Titus, who would go on to become one of Rome's most beloved emperors. Titus's reign, though short, was marked by compassion and strong leadership in times of crisis. One of the defining moments of Titus's reign was the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. The eruption, which destroyed the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, was one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in Roman history. Titus, despite the fact that he had only just assumed the throne, acted quickly to provide aid and relief to the affected areas. His response to the disaster endeared him to the Roman people, who saw in him a leader who cared about their welfare. Unfortunately, Titus's reign was cut short by his premature death in 81 CE, likely due to illness. Titus's death marked the end of his promising reign, but his legacy would be carried on by his brother Domitian, the third and final Flavian emperor. Domitian, unlike his father and brother, was a more controversial and autocratic ruler. His reign, which lasted from 81 to 96 CE, would ultimately be marked by increasing despotism and paranoia. Domitian sought to strengthen his power by increasing the authority of the emperor and diminishing the influence of the Senate. His reign was characterized by a series of purges, in which many senators and aristocrats were executed or exiled for perceived disloyalty. Domitian's authoritarian policies alienated much of the Roman elite, and his paranoia led him to suspect even his closest advisors. Despite his tyrannical tendencies, Domitian also implemented a number of important reforms during his reign. He was known for his public building projects, including the construction of new temples and the expansion of the imperial palace. He also worked to stabilize the empire's finances, and he continued the military campaigns in the empire's border regions, particularly along the Rhine and Danube rivers. Domitian's military successes were significant, but his reputation was tainted by his increasingly erratic behavior and heavy-handed rule. The end of Domitian's reign came in 96 CE, when he was assassinated by a conspiracy of his own officials. His death marked the end of the Flavian dynasty, and the Senate, eager to restore stability to the empire, quickly declared Nerva, an elderly senator, as the new emperor. Nerva's accession marked the beginning of the Five Good Emperors, a series of rulers who would bring a period of relative peace and prosperity to the Roman Empire. The Flavians, despite the darker elements of Domitian's reign, had restored order to the empire after the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors. They left a lasting legacy of military success, architectural achievement, and imperial expansion, even if their dynasty was ultimately overshadowed by the more benevolent rulers that followed. The legacy of Julius Caesar and the empire. The story of Julius Caesar is one that would forever change the course of Roman history, as well as the fate of the entire Roman Empire. He was a man who embodied the complexity of power, ambition, and vision, shaping an empire that would endure for centuries after his death. Caesar's rise to power was meteoric, but his influence reached far beyond his own lifetime. His edict on Rome is felt even today, as his name continues to echo through the ages, not just as a title of kings and emperors, but as a symbol of imperial authority. Caesar's political genius and military prowess brought him to the forefront of Roman politics at a time when the Republic was already on the brink of collapse. The political structure that had once been the pride of Rome, built on a delicate balance of power between the Senate, the people, and the military, was now riddled with corruption and inequality. Caesar was quick to exploit these weaknesses, using them to his advantage, yet he also believed deeply in Rome's potential for greatness. His actions, though controversial, were driven by a vision of Rome's future, one where it could overcome internal strife and flourish as the dominant power of the ancient world. The events that led to Caesar crossing the Rubicon in 49 BCE are often described as the moment when the fate of the Roman Republic was sealed. This bold act, an open declaration of war against the Senate and his political opponents, marked the beginning of a new era in Roman governance. Caesar's march into Italy, his swift military victories, and the eventual defeat of Pompey and his allies were only the beginning of his transformation from a general to the supreme ruler of Rome. The people hailed him as a hero, as he promised them land and reform, and he moved quickly to centralize power in his hands. The Senate, meanwhile, became increasingly wary of his growing authority, and the aristocracy viewed his populism with suspicion. But Caesar was not simply a man of ambition, he was a man of action, and his reforms were groundbreaking. He enacted laws to help the poor, redistributed land to veterans, and reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that would remain in use for centuries. His political maneuvering also led to the creation of the First Triumvirate, an alliance with Pompey and Crassus that allowed him to dominate the political landscape of Rome for years. Yet as his power grew, so did the fear among his enemies, who saw him as a threat to the Republic's fragile system. In 44 BCE, Caesar was declared dictator for life, a title that many saw as a clear sign of his desire to become king. His assassination on the Ides of March 44 BCE was the result of this fear, as a group of conspirators, including some of his closest allies, believed that his death would restore the old ways of the Republic. However, Caesar's assassination did not bring about the restoration of the Republic as the conspirators had hoped. Instead, it sparked a power struggle that would lead to the rise of his adopted heir, Octavian, later Augustus, and the eventual establishment of the Roman Empire. Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, cleverly maneuvered through the political chaos that followed Caesar's death. He formed an alliance with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, known as the Second Triumvirate, to defeat Caesar's assassins and take control of Rome. After a series of civil wars and betrayals, Octavian emerged as the sole ruler of Rome, becoming Augustus, the first Roman emperor. In 27 BCE, the establishment of the Roman Empire marked the end of the Republic and the beginning of an imperial age. Augustus carefully crafted the image of the benevolent ruler, promising peace and stability after years of civil war. However, it was under his reign that Rome truly began to change, consolidating power under the emperor and centralizing authority in ways that would influence all subsequent rulers. Augustus ushered in a period of relative peace and prosperity known as the Pax Romana, which lasted for over 2 centuries. But it was also a time when the emperor became the central figure of Roman life and governance. Even after Augustus, the legacy of Caesar endured. His influence continued to shape the policies of future emperors, many of whom claimed descent from him and built their reigns upon the foundation he had laid. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which followed Augustus, was directly descended from Caesar, and each emperor who came after him either invoked his name or sought to emulate his successors. The emperors of the Julio-Claudian line, including Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, each played a role in carrying forward the empire Caesar had set in motion. Though their reigns were often marked by excess, cruelty, and instability,
The empire they ruled remained the most powerful entity in the ancient world. In many ways, the Roman Empire that emerged from Caesar's death was a reflection of his vision. Though he never fully realized his dream of a restored republic, he laid the groundwork for an empire that would endure for centuries. His military campaigns expanded Rome's borders to unprecedented length, and his leadership style set a precedent for future emperors, who sought to maintain both the loyalty of the people and the strength of the military. Caesar's reforms in the Senate, his attention to public works, and his populist rhetoric all became key elements of imperial rule, even as the structure of Roman governance shifted from a republic to an autocracy. The legacy of Julius Caesar can also be seen in the cultural and social changes that took place under Roman imperial rule. Caesar's reforms aimed at increasing the power of the lower classes, granting citizenship to many people outside Rome, and strengthening the city's infrastructure. All had long-lasting effects on the Roman world. His reign was the beginning of the Romanization of the provinces, as local elites in conquered lands began to adopt Roman customs, language, and law. The process of Romanization would continue under future emperors, helping to bind the empire together and create a common Roman identity among its vast and diverse population. But Caesar's legacy was not without its contradictions. He was a man of the people, yet his rule also marked the beginning of a more autocratic system that would leave future generations grappling with the question of whether Rome could ever return to its republican roots. Caesar's assassination, in many ways, marked the last gasp of the Roman Republic, as the idea of a free and balanced government was slowly replaced by a system in which the emperor was the final authority. The Senate, once a powerful institution, became little more than a rubber-stamp body. As the power of the emperor grew, this shift from republicanism to imperialism would shape the future of Rome, for better or for worse, for centuries to come. In the centuries following Caesar's death, his name became synonymous with power and authority. The term Caesar was used by emperors as a title, a mark of their imperial status. Even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 47 CE, the legacy of Caesar lived on in the Byzantine Empire, where the title Caesar continued to be used by emperors until the empire's fall in 1453. In the medieval period, the Holy Roman Emperors claimed a connection to Julius Caesar, and his name continued to carry the weight of authority in Europe. Today, the legacy of Julius Caesar is celebrated not only in historical texts, but in popular culture, where he is often portrayed as a figure of immense ambition and power. His story is one of triumph and tragedy, of a man who sought to shape the world in his image, but whose dreams were cut short by betrayal. Julius Caesar remains one of the most iconic figures in history, his name forever linked with the rise of the Roman Empire and the transformation of the ancient world. His legacy continues to inspire discussions about power, leadership, and the consequences of ambition, making him a timeless figure whose influence extends far beyond the borders of ancient Rome.